Hey everybody, and welcome to Train Signal. In this lesson we're going to talk about planning your installation of SQL Server. Now that's going to include not only which edition to choose and how to choose the edition that you're going to install, but also things you need to take into consideration on the server side as well. But first, I'd like to give you a little SQL Server overview before we get started with all of that. So when I usually see these types of overviews given of SQL, I usually see these pretty little diagrams of all of the pieces fit into a wheel with something at the hub or set into different layers so you can see all the different players in there. And I just really don't think that all that is necessary for what we're trying to accomplish here. In fact, I'm going to take a different spin on it altogether and just kind of give you a real world assessment of what SQL is all about. Let's start with SQL's perception. Out in the industry, SQL is becoming more and more accepted, and it has been for many years now, but there are some aspects of the industry that still look at SQL Server as sort of a baby database or something that only fake IT or fake DBAs go to, right? Those that can't hack it in the real world. 30 years ago, that may have been more true. 20 years ago, it may have been more true. But now, SQL Server is a major player in the market, and it's actually even better than some of the other big four, the big four being Microsoft, IBM, Oracle, and Sybase. So each one of these products is going to have its own strengths compared to the other ones, and Microsoft's big strength, aside from being a very solid database engine and a very fast database engine, don't let anybody fool you or tell you otherwise, and we'll talk about that again in a minute. But one of Microsoft's big strengths is giving you a very complete scenario. And I guess suite would be a better word for it, because you don't only get the database engine with replication and compression and CDC and log shipping and all of these other things, right? You also get reporting, you get ETL, you get analytics, you get integration with Office and SharePoint. And these are things you just get right out of the box. And the competitors really don't offer that wide of a selection of a suite of products right out of the box of their database engine. And even if they do have it as part of the database engine, they actually charge you extra for using those certain features. Now, some of the BI stuff may cost extra for SQL Server, but absolutely everything else is included. If you need a reporting server, it's included. If you need an ETL engine, it's included. If you need to compress your data, it's included. If you need to compress your backups or if you need to encrypt your database, it's included. So all of these things are included in the suite. So don't fool yourself and think that this is just a database engine. This is a suite of database products from end to end, all the way from data creation, all the way to analytics and BI. So it's a very rich suite. Now, as far as speed goes, I promised we'd get back to speed. SQL Server really holds its own. I've gone toe-to-toe with plenty of Oracle guys and IBM guys, and if you look at SQL Server, at Microsoft's published benchmarks on SQL Server, you can see that it more than holds its own with those other big databases. I can't say with those big databases, but with the other big four, right? And again, the big four is Microsoft, about some of the differences in the additions. Okay, here we are on the Microsoft SQL Server site, and it's just microsoft.com/SQL Server, and then you come up and click on additions, and you'll be right here. So here you see you have the three big additions. You've got Enterprise, BI, and Standard. And while they've got nice little descriptions, so we know what those are. So if you notice here, there's only three things that BI has that Standard doesn't. And you notice BI is the middle one and Standard is the last one. So here, BI comes with the self-service BI stuff, and that's the alerting and the Power View and the Power Pivot for SharePoint. And it also comes with the advanced corporate BI, which is the tabular BI schematic model, advanced analytics reporting and whatnot, right? Vertipack, I'm sorry, and advanced data mining. Now, all that is some pretty rich stuff. If you're using data mining, then you don't have to ask me what it is. If you have to ask me what it is, then trust me, you're not going to be using it, because data mining is a very deep, difficult BI feature that many people have a hard time wrapping their minds around. So if you have to ask what it is, you're probably not going to be using it. And of course, it comes with things like data quality services and master data services. We're going to talk about that later on in the course. And those are the only three things that BI has that Standard doesn't. Know that Enterprise is getting up there price-wise. You'll know it if you're on Enterprise, because it's very expensive. Standard is very reasonable. It's a lot cheaper than Enterprise, and you can see you still get a lot of functionality. Okay, now that we've looked into what I'm going to call the marketing aspects of which edition to choose, and that's going to be just the features that are available in each one. So that was just kind of an introduction of which features are available. Let's go ahead and take a look at what's going to happen in the real world most of the time. Okay, so while the differences in the editions on the website are nice, that's just really a list of things that each edition has, and that's not even inclusive. There's an exhaustive list out there somewhere that gets into the minutia of everything that you can get with each one of the editions. But I'll tell you, that's really not the way it happens most of the time. Most of the time, especially in big shops, it boils down to three things. Number one, what does the vendor support? Now, I've seen everything from vendors who are very heavy-handed and expect you to be on a specific service pack and hotfix level, to vendors who just said, well, be on one of these two versions and we don't really care which edition because we're not doing anything really big. But vendor support, don't underestimate vendor support, because that's going to be your main driving factor most of the time. And the vendor will usually give you guidance on what you can and can't do with their product so that you can make a decision. Now, one thing I'm going to tell you about vendor support, quite often a vendor will say something like, oh, well, we can do a SQL Server 2012 Standard Edition. And then you'll say, okay, well, we're going to put Enterprise on there because of this. And they go, well, we don't know if we support that. Trust me, if they support Standard, they support Enterprise. The only difference is Enterprise has more functionality. It's not going to break anything to go from Standard to Enterprise. However, if they only support Enterprise, chances are you can't go to Standard, because that means that they're using some feature in Enterprise that's not going to be available on Standard. So you may actually break their product if you try to put Standard Edition when they say they only support Enterprise. But you can go up. If they say they only support Standard, there's no reason why you can't go to Enterprise. So the second thing, failing that, right? Let's say that they say they support Standard and above. Now the decision is internal. Well, you've got some questions to answer. And I always ask my business units a few basic questions about how they plan to use the product and about what their business cycle is going to be like to help them make this decision. I think next in line is going to be reindexing, because it almost always comes down to something like reindexing. I'll usually ask them something like, okay, is this a 24/7 application? And they'll say yes. Okay, so by 24/7, do you mean that you're going to have users on there all the time, so all night long? How many users are going to be on this at a given time? And they'll say something like 200. Okay, so are you going to have 200 users 24/7, or are you going to have 200 users during business hours, and then in the middle of the night it may drop to 10 or 15? And that really matters, right? Because when you go to do reindexing, you need to know how many users are going to be on the system and what level of performance they expect. Because if they expect there to be next to no interruption, because you are actually going to have 200 users on all night long. I mean, if it's really going to be a 24/7 application with, hundreds of users on 24/7, then yeah, you can't take time to lock up your tables while you're doing reindexing and bring the database to a halt. You're going to have to be on Enterprise Edition. So here, I'll tell you, I'll illustrate this with another story. This happened to me a couple years ago, where a user came to me and said, we're starting up a brand new SQL box. I need you to install SQL. And I went through all of this, and I asked her, and she was more than a user. She was actually the manager of the group. And I asked her, okay, is this going to be a 24/7 app? And she goes, absolutely. And I said, okay, so how many users? I said, so what's going to be the ratio of users from the daytime to the nighttime? She goes, well, there's going to be about the same number of five users if she had come up to me, if in this third one I said, okay, now let's talk about HADR. What exactly do you need? If she had said, oh, well, we need this to have, 3 readable mirrors, and we need to have, automatic page corruption fixing with our mirror and all of that, and all of that deep level stuff that you get from Enterprise, I really may have considered putting her back into Enterprise. So even though she didn't meet the reindexing requirement or the user requirement, maybe the data is important enough that you absolutely cannot afford to miss anything. And that's the kind of thing that may kick you back in Enterprise. So you just you have to make that decision. And really it's going to be the business's decision, right? Make sure that they know what they're getting into with each edition, and then let them make that decision. And like I said earlier, there are a lot of other differences between the editions than were just listed on that website. Somewhere over there is an exhaustive list of features, and you almost get dizzy looking at them because there's just dozens and dozens. But I really do find that most of the time it boils down to one of these 3 things. I've never had anybody say, I have to have Enterprise because I absolutely need CDC, or I absolutely have to have data compression. I've never seen that before. Nor have I had anybody ask me if they could compress their data, and I would say, well, no, you're on standard edition, and have them ask me to upgrade to Enterprise just so that they could compress their data. Maybe somebody out there has, and that's fine. But I'm just saying I've personally never seen that, so it's not going to happen that often. But most of the time you are going to come up, it's these 3 things that are going to be the deciding factor on which edition you want to use. And the other ones, while they may be very minor factors and nice to haves, you'd be really surprised how much an application team or a company insists that one particular feature or one set of features is really important, and it's going to break them if they don't get it. And then they see the price tag. And I even threw an Express in this one. So all of them pretty much can work on the same level of Windows on Windows Server 2012, but it's when you start getting into R2 that you need to really kind of be careful, because although they all require SP1, if the application is going to be on the same box as the database, then maybe the application doesn't support SP1. So you need to kind of be aware of that kind of thing. And you should always ask them whether or not the application is going to be on the same box, because you really don't want to have anything else on your box other than SQL. You really want to have a dedicated SQL box. And most of the time in all of my shops, that's a standard. I won't allow anything else to be installed on the SQL box because it just steals resources and causes problems that shouldn't be there. Now, I will point out one thing that's really cool is 2 of these editions can be installed on Windows RT, which is the new Windows 8 Mobile Edition. So that's actually pretty cool. And down here, of course, you can see the minimum requirements. And the biggest thing that's going to come into play for you is the CPUs. I'll outline that one here for you. And this is the maximum compute capacity for the database engine. So what that means is these are the max CPUs that it can support. And you can see here that the only one that can support the OS maximum is Enterprise. So if your company bought a server with 48 cores and they want to put SQL Standard on there because they don't have money for Enterprise, well, this can only have 16 cores. You really can't do that. I mean, you can, but you'll only have 16 cores and you'll be wasting the rest of those cores. So, you're also bound by the hardware, right? Okay, so that's it for choosing the edition of SQL. Let's go ahead and move on and talk about capacity planning. Okay, so there are a few things that you really need to take into account when you look at capacity planning for your server. And right now I'm really talking about disk space more than anything because disk space is key, right? It's a database that stores everything on disk. So this is probably the most important aspect of the server. It's also the slowest part of the server because it's the one with all the moving parts, right? CPU and memory, well, they're going to be fast anyway, but disk really needs a lot of consideration. Now, first and foremost, and I didn't put this in the slides because it's kind of a given, but I'm gonna talk about it anyway, is vendor recommendations. The vendor will always have some recommendations on how you should size your disk, and if it's a big time app, then they always have some sort of sizing mechanism that they can say if you've got this many servers or this many users, this many units of whatever we sell, then here's how big your database can get over time. Sometimes they're very accurate, sometimes they're not accurate at all because there are just too many factors involved. But if the vendor can't even size it properly, then we don't stand a chance. So go with the vendor recommendation on sizing the database itself. I'm talking about all the extra stuff that the vendor never takes into account and that you can plan for a little bit better. But even then, it's just going to be kind of a guessing game. Oh, and by the way, if this isn't a vendor app, if it's an in-house app, then you're going to need some kind of benchmark, some kind of something to size your database off of. So size it off of the dev environment or the QA environment, something. Somebody needs to be able to tell you what the database initial size is going to be and what kind of growth they expect to see. They can't expect you to size this without any information whatsoever, because then it'll just be a stab in the dark. There are two ways to go with that, right? Really conservative, and by that I mean buying the smallest server possible. That's on an OLTP system really light on CPU and memory. It's really mostly disk heavy. Well, reindexing is really high on CPU and memory, so they grossly undersized that. CheckDB. This is the same thing as snapshots, because CheckDB works off of a snapshot by default, but you've got to keep enough space in order to hold that snapshot, that growing snapshot, while you're running your CheckDB. And a CheckDB, depending on the size of the database, can take hours. So it's a little bit different than running a snapshot, than creating a snapshot before an update, before a database upgrade, right? Because that may only take a few minutes, but a CheckDB, I've seen CheckDBs on large databases last for, 7 and 12 hours. And all of that is time that snapshot is growing. So that's just something that you need to take into consideration. Growth rate as well, I think we've already covered that. But how fast and how big is your database going to get, right? You never want to run a disk at full capacity. You always want at least 20% free. And you don't want to be adding disks every month. So put enough disk out there initially. And I see this a lot, where a company doesn't want to put a terabyte or 2 terabytes of disk under a database that's only 20 gigs. But if it's going to grow really fast and by the end of the year it's going to be a terabyte or 2, well, go ahead and allocate that space now. What are you waiting for, right? So they consider it to be a waste, but it's not a waste. You're just pre-allocating it. To say that money is a waste is like saying that you keeping a savings account is a waste. Well, you're wasting your money because you're squirreling it away for a later day. No, I'm not wasting it. Snapshot isolation and all that. So just do the best you can with TempDB, but regardless of what you do, always separate the data and the log files for TempDB. It's just a smart thing to do. And if there's any question whatsoever about performance, go ahead and separate those two up front. Don't wait until you have a performance problem and then bring the application down and then separate your data and log files on TempDB. So go ahead and start doing that. As a matter of fact, do that for all your databases. Separate the data and the log files for all of your databases, except system. I think you can get away without having, master or MSDB, but maybe MSDB may need it too. If you're logging a gazillion job logs, then maybe you would need to separate the data and log for MSDB too. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is make sure you have enough spindles to perform the work you need to perform. And that may leave a lot of extra space. And companies don't like to see that. They don't like to see, a 200 gig database on 1.5 terabytes of drive because it's a waste of space. But you know what? If it's a really, really busy database, you may need that many spindles just to get the performance that you need for that database. And they consider it a waste because, well, look at all this space that we're wasting. But you're not wasting space, you're gaining spindles. So they're just looking at it the wrong way. But hey, performance is performance. If they don't want to put that many spindles behind it, then let them suffer with the performance, right? And TempDB is one of those. TempDB is one of those that I'm perfectly willing to put on a lot larger drive so that I can get all the performance out of it I can by adding all those extra spindles to it. So there you go. There's some capacity planning and feature selection of SQL Server. This is going to get you started on making the right choices before you even install, and you really can't skip this step. This is a very important step. If you try to skip this step and just kind of rush through it, then you're going to ensure that you have some kind of problem in the future. And you may have problems anyway, but at least you can try, and experience is going to teach you a lot. The more you do this, the more you start seeing the things that are going to be important to your company, and you're going to start being able to make better decisions on hardware and on SQL additions and features and all of that stuff. So okay, thanks for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next lesson.